Revelation chapter 12. If you did not get a handout, raise your hand. We will get you one. Once we get into Revelation chapter 13, this handout will make more sense. Revelation chapter 12, we looked at almost the entire chapter the last time we had class, and it deals with the behind-the-scenes reason for the persecution of the Christians. Satan, who is the dragon, who is identified in Revelation chapter 12 and verse 9, is the one behind all of the problems that the church is facing, all the problems of persecution that's coming upon the church. In verses 1 through 5 of Revelation 12, we saw how that Satan was at work to try to thwart or disrail, so to speak, or to cause the scheme of redemption not to come to pass by waiting for the woman representing Israel to give birth to this special child, which of course is Christ. He's identified in verse 5 as the one who would rule all nations with a rod of iron and was caught up to God and His throne. Well, of course, that's referring to Christ. Satan was not able to do that. Then we learn about the spiritual warfare that is going on with behind the scenes with the devil and Michael and the archangels there in the latter part of verses 6 through 12. The reason why that Satan is on the earth and the reason why he is so angry and upset is because he knows that he has a short time. 1 Peter chapter 5 verses 8 through 9 speaks of Satan being on earth, and he's roaming about as a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. So we talked about that last time we had class, how that misery loves company. The devil knows that he is going to be cast into the lake of fire, and he wants to take as many humans that will go with him to that fiery destiny. And he wants to take me, and he wants to take you with him. And so because he has a short time, he knows that he cannot fight against God and win. So he's going to go against the saints. He's going to persecute the church. Verse 13 of Revelation 12, now when the dragon saw that he had been cast to earth, he persecuted the woman who gave birth to the male child. As I said before, there's a transition here in the imagery. The imagery of the woman in verses 1 through 5 now has changed from Israel, nationalistic Israel, to spiritual Israel, the church. And so the devil is persecuting the church on earth. Look at verse 14. But the woman was given 2 wings of a great eagle, that she might fly into the wilderness to her place, where she is nourished for a time, times and half a time, that's 3.5, from the presence of the serpent, from the presence of the devil. Exodus chapter 19, verses 4 through 5, speak of how God rescued Israel out of Egyptian bondage, and the imagery there is giving them wings to fly. And so the same imagery here of God protecting His church, giving them deliverance from their persecutors. Revelation 12 and verse 15, so the serpent spewed water out of his mouth like a flood after the woman, that he might cause her to be carried away by the flood. But the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed up the flood which the dragon had spewed out of his mouth. So the imagery here of a outpouring of persecution, a flood of persecution. But there was help there. God providentially taking care of helping His people. Verse 17. And the dragon was enraged with the woman. Remember, the woman there is referring to the church. And went to make war with the rest of her offspring. That's talking about those who would be converted, those who would belong to Christ as Christians, who keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ. So the devil is making war against the saints. And in the context of the first century, it would be the Roman Empire, would be the system by which the devil is using on earth to bring persecution and problems to the church. But in a much broader sense, when you look at this, look at verse 17, the devil is after the church, after Christians, those who keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ. You see, the devil is after those who are faithful. He already has the world. He's after those who are faithful. He's after those who keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ. That's the gospel. He already has the unfaithful Christian, the one who's fallen away. But the devil is trying to get people who are faithful to become unfaithful. And he will use any means necessary to accomplish that goal. Chapter 12, Revelation chapter 12 is the backdrop to chapter 13. Because we understand that the devil is the one behind all this. He's the one that's orchestrating this persecution, this problem that the church is facing. We can now go into chapter 13 and see a little bit more detail concerning by what means the dragon is using people on earth to accomplish his goal, and using the Roman Empire on earth to accomplish his fight against the saints. Look at Revelation 13 and verse 1. Remember, John is seeing these visions. And he says, "Then I stood on the sand of the sea, and I saw a beast rising up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns. And on his horns 10 crowns, and on his heads a blasphemous name." Verse 2. "Now the beast which I saw was like a leopard. His feet were like the feet of a bear. His mouth was like the mouth of a lion. The dragon gave him his power and his throne and great authority." Now, okay, who is the dragon we were introduced to in chapter 12? The devil, Satan. So this creature rising up out of the sea has been given its power and authority by the devil. Now I want you to notice, if you remember our study in the book of Daniel, you will see this imagery is reminiscent of Daniel chapter 7. Look at Daniel chapter 7. That's why this chart of comparison has been handed out. Daniel chapter 7. As I said before, we had to study Daniel first before we get into the book of Revelation, because a lot of what Daniel saw is fulfilled during the book of Revelation. So he sees, John sees in Revelation chapter 13, this creature coming up out of the sea. The sea of this sounds familiar. Daniel chapter 7 and verse 2. Daniel spoke, saying, "I saw in my visions by night, and behold, the 4 winds of the heaven were stirring up the great sea." Verse 3, "And 4 beasts came up from the sea, each different from the other." So here you have beasts coming up out of a sea. Verse 4, "The first was like a lion, and had eagle's wings, and I watched till its wings were plucked off, and it was lifted up from the earth, and made it to stand on 2 feet like a man, and a man's heart was given to it." Verse 5, "And suddenly another beast, a second beast, like a bear, it raised up on one side, and had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth, and they said thus to it, Arise, devour much flesh." Verse 6, "After this I looked, and there was another, like a leopard, which had on its back 4 wings of a bird, and the beast also had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it." Now, you see these same imagery here of the beast, of these creatures, in Revelation chapter 13 and verse 2, but it's all compiled into one beast. It's a composite of all of these beasts into one beast. Revelation 13 and verse 2. Now the beast which I saw was like a leopard. His feet were like the feet of a bear. His mouth was like the mouth of a lion. And the dragon gave him power and his authority and great authority. So you see here in Revelation 13 and verse 2, the composite of all of these beasts. Now, remember our study in Daniel 7. The lion represented the Babylonian Empire. Remember, the Babylonians took the Jewish captives in the 70 years of Babylonian captivity. Daniel 7 and verse 4 is talking about the Babylonian Empire. Then there was an empire that succeeded that. Verse 5. The bear represents the Medo-Persian Empire that succeeded the Babylonian Empire. Then verse 6, the leopard represents the Macedonian or Greek Empire with Alexander the Great. We've got a movie out now called Alexander. It's about this person here who conquered much of the world at that time. And he was prophesied in Daniel that he would do the work that he did. So we look back on history and see what he did. Well, Daniel was living before Alexander was born and saw by inspiration the work that he would do with this symbolism of a leopard. And so the Macedonian Empire is pictured there in verse 6 of Daniel chapter 7. Now we come to Daniel 7 and verse 7. After this I saw in the night vision, and behold, a fourth beast, dreadful and terrible, exceedingly strong. It had huge teeth of iron. It was devouring, breaking in pieces, and trampling the residue with its feet. It was different from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. Revelation 13 and verse 1. Then I stood on the sand of the sea. John says, and I saw a beast rising up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns. Talking about the same beast. And the reason why, when you look at the comparison chart here, you see that the lion, the bear, and leopard, and the beast with 10 horns is compared to the beast that John sees in Revelation 13 is because all the territories of the Babylonians, the Medo-Persians, and the Greeks were conquered by the Romans. And that's why in Revelation chapter 13, this beast is a composite of all of these beasts put together. Rome conquered all of those territories that were once occupied by the Babylonians, the Medo-Persians, and the Greeks. So you have this comparison given, and you see this creature that's rising up out of the sea in Daniel chapter 7 is the same thing that John is seeing. And this creature has behind it the power of Satan. It has behind it the power of Satan. Now, we're going to go back to Daniel chapter 7, but let's go back to Revelation chapter 13 and look at a few more verses. So you see John seeing this creature made up of all of these different creatures, the leopard, the bear, the lion. All of these are found in this one creature. Verse 3, John says, Revelation 13 and verse 3, and I saw one of his heads as if it had been mortally wounded, and his deadly wound was healed, and all the world marveled and followed the beast. You have one of the heads of the creature mortally wounded. Some scholars believe that this is referring to Nero's persecution that really started the persecution against the Christians, but then that persecution kind of died down. Then later it was revived by Domitian, who is the emperor of the book of Revelation. So it symbolically, it was mortally wounded and then it was revived. Look at verse 4. Revelation 13 and verse 4. So they worshiped the dragon who gave authority to the beast, and they worshiped the beast, saying, who is like the beast? Who is able to make war with him? So this beast, this creature that they're seeing, they're saying, this creature is unstoppable. Who can make war against this beast? Verse 5, Revelation 13 and verse 5. And he was given a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies. And he was given authority to continue for 42 months. That's 3 1/2. Half of 7. Half of a complete number, the complete number 7. Verse 6, then he opened his mouth in blasphemy against God, to blaspheme his name, his tabernacle, and those who dwell in heaven. Verse 7, it was granted to him to make war with the saints and to overcome them, and authority was given to him over every tribe, tongue, and nation. So you have the extent of this empire. It's a worldwide empire. Many different tribes, tongues, and nations were in this empire. And of course, that is exactly what you find when you study the Roman Empire. They encompassed many different nations, many different people were inside of its dominion. Now, this beast here is speaking blasphemous things against God, against his tabernacle who dwell in heaven, and he's making war against the saints and overcoming them. Let's go back to Daniel chapter 7. Daniel chapter 7. This fourth beast that Daniel is seeing in his vision, it's a creature unlike all the others before it. Verse 7 is basically saying it's a powerful beast. Verse 8, I was considering the horns, and there was another horn, a little one, coming up among them, before whom 3 of the first horns were plucked out by the roots. And there in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking pompous words. Speaking pompous words. There was a leader within this empire who was speaking pompous words. Look at verse 17. Daniel 7 and verse 17. Those great beasts which are four kings which arise out of the earth. Verse 18, but the saints of the Most High shall receive the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever, even forever and ever. Verse 19, then I wish to know the truth about the fourth beast, Daniel is saying, which was different from all the others, exceedingly dreadful, with its teeth of iron and its nails of bronze, which devoured, broke in pieces, and trampled the residue with its feet. Verse 20, the 10 horns that were on its head, and the other horn which came up, before which 3 fell, namely the horn that had eyes, and a mouth which spoke pompous, or some translations might say blasphemous, words, whose appearance was greater than his fellows. Verse 21, I was watching the same horn was making war against the saints and prevailing against them. So Daniel is seeing within this beast, this leader, a horn, in this language represents a leader, represents power. Here is a leader coming up, and he is speaking blasphemous things. Look at verse 25. Daniel 7 and verse 25. He was speaking pompous or blasphemous words against the Most High, shall persecute the saints of the Most High. This leader will rise, and he will speak pompous words and blasphemous words, and he will persecute the saints of the Most High. That exactly parallels Revelation chapter 13. Well, what in the world does all that mean? Here's what it's talking about. It's talking about the Emperor Domitian of the first century, who demanded that people worship him. He gave himself the title of Lord God. In fact, from what I read earlier today, he wouldn't even accept documents unless it had the title Lord God on it. He wouldn't even read the document. And he, because he wanted to be worshipped, would set up throughout his empire, the Roman Empire, statues of himself. And you had to bow down to that image and worship that image. And if you didn't, you were put in prison and you were killed. Now, for a polytheistic society who believe that there are multitudes of gods, that's not a problem. You just add one more god to the list. Well, this fellow, Domitian, thinks he's a god. We'll just add him to the list. But for people who believe in the one true God, the God of heaven, Christians, they're not going to worship him. And because they will not compromise, they will not bow down and worship Domitian, they're in trouble with him. Therefore, he is going to make war against them. In other words, he's going to persecute them. He's going to kill them. He's going to cause it to where they have economic hardship. And all kinds of terrible things will come upon the saints of the Most High, talking about the church, the Christians, because they refuse to bow down and worship the emperor. Daniel saw that hundreds of years before the events ever took place. Some 500 years before the events took place. John is experiencing it. John is on the Isle of Patmos because of persecution. That's why he's seeing this vision. And so what has been given to John, in essence, in Revelation chapter 13, is saying, look, John, this was talked about in Daniel. Daniel prophesied that this would happen. And you're seeing the fulfillment of it. And so, back to Revelation chapter 13, you have this beast, who is a combination of all the previous empires, because it encompasses all their lands, speaking against God because he's claiming himself to be God, which is blasphemy. And in verse 7, he is making war against the saints, and authority was given to him over every tribe, tongue, and nation. It's a worldwide empire. Verse 8, Revelation 13 and verse 8, all who dwell on the earth will worship him. They're going to worship him, whose names have not been written in the book of life of the Lamb, slain from the foundation of the world. So everyone who's not a Christian will worship him. But those who have their names written in the book of life of the Lamb, slain from the foundation of the world, will not. The faithful Christians will not. Well, the book of life, we come across that several times in the book of Revelation. The book of life is just talking about the list of the saved. Look at Revelation chapter 20. Revelation chapter 20 and verse 12, we come across the book of life. It's referring to the list or the ledger of the saved. Verse 12. John said, I saw the dead, small and the great, standing before God, and the books were opened, and another book was opened, which is the book of life. And the dead were judged according to their works by the things which were written in the books. The sea gave up the dead who were in it. Death and Hades delivered up the dead who were in them. And they were judged, each one according to their works. Look at verse 14. Then death and Hades were cast into the lake of fire. This is the second death. Verse 15, and anyone not found in the book of life was cast into the lake of fire. So that book of life is referring to those who are saved, those who are faithful, those who will not bow down to the world and bow down to the emperor and the Roman Empire, because their commitment is to Christ. He is their king, and they will not compromise. Back to Revelation chapter 13, verse 9. If anyone has an ear to hear, let him hear. He who leads into captivity shall go into captivity. He who kills with the sword must be killed with the sword. Here is the patience and the faith of the saints. In other words, those who lead into captivity, it's going to come back on them. You reap what you sow, in other words. He who kills with the sword must be killed with the sword. You reap what you sow. Here is the endurance and the faith of the saints. They're enduring this, and those who have their names in the Lamb's book of life will endure to the end. They will be faithful to the end, and they will receive the crown of life. Revelation 2 and verse 10. So we have here the sea beast in the first part of Revelation 13. Behind the sea beast is the dragon. Satan is at work. Satan is at work. Now we're going to see another beast. We're going to see another beast. Look at verse 11. Then I saw another beast coming up out of the earth. This is the land beast. The first one came up out of the sea. This one is coming up out of the land. I saw another beast coming up out of the earth. He had 2 horns like a lamb and spoke like a dragon. Now the dragon is talking about Satan. So we know that behind this beast, whatever it represents, Satan is behind it. Satan is behind it. Verse 12, and he exercises all the authority of the first beast. Well, the first beast is the sea beast. So the second land beast exercises all the authority of the first beast in his presence and causes the earth and those who dwell in it to worship the first beast whose deadly wound was healed. So you have this beast helping the first beast and causing people to worship the first beast. Verse 13, he performed great signs so that he even makes fire come down from heaven on the earth in the sight of all men. So here you have the false miracles, the false signs, the false wonders. And you know, the Bible makes it very clear that the devil is given a limited amount of power to deceive those who don't love the truth. People will fall for just about anything. And if you don't believe it, watch WWF wrestling. Do you know that there are people who actually think that is real? Please don't raise your hand. I don't want to know if you do. There are people who I have relatives who actually, and they're older than I am, think that that's the real stuff. They are convinced in their mind that's real. And you see these televangelists on TV with all of their crusades and they're knocking people down when they touch them and they breathe on them and all that stuff. And people think, oh, that's the power of God. They just think that that's God working. Look at it. Look at all those people falling down. That's God working. People will fall for anything. And so the devil is working, even in the Roman Empire, to deceive people. Wasn't there a man by the name of Simon the sorcerer in the book of Acts who deceived people and people thought he was the great power of God? And then when he was confronted with genuine miracles, he saw the difference pretty quick. But the devil has the ability to perform pseudo-miracles or pseudo-displays of power to deceive people. Look at 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. In 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, the Apostle Paul is making the point that Christ is not going to return until a falling away takes place. We look back on history and we see that falling away. It resulted in Roman Catholicism and all the denominations. That's basically the result of the falling away. Look at verse in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. Talks about a person who is a lawless one. Verse 7 says, the mystery of lawlessness is already at work. Only he who now restrains will do so until he is taken out of the way. Verse 8, and then the lawless one will be revealed, whom the Lord will consume with the breath of his mouth and destroy with the brightness of his coming. Verse 9, the coming of the lawless one is according to the working of Satan with all power, signs, and lying wonders. Verse 10, with all unrighteous deception among those who perish because they did not receive the love of the truth that they might be saved. Verse 11, for this reason God will send them a strong delusion that they should believe the lie. Verse 12, that they may all be condemned who do not believe the truth but have pleasure in unrighteousness. The devil will work with all power, signs, and lying wonders to convince certain people, and God will let it happen. Because they have this mindset. They don't have a love of the truth, verse 10. You know, people who have a love of the truth are not going to be deceived by false things, false miracles, false wonders, things like that. But Satan is at work, back to Revelation chapter 13, in the Roman Empire, and performing these great signs, and he even makes a fire come down from heaven on the earth in the sight of men. So it's talking about these false signs that he's involved in to deceive people. And when you read history, and you read about how when they would set up the altars, and they would set up the statues for Domitian, and for people to worship the image, they would have all kind of tricks and things that they would do, sleight of hand, so to speak, to deceive people into thinking that Domitian was actually a god, was actually a deity, and people fell for it. People fell for it. It's like people fall for things today. Look at verse 14. He deceives those who dwell on the earth. Of course, this is talking about those who dwell within the dominion of the beast, by those signs which he was granted to do in the sight of the beast, telling those who dwell on the earth to make an image to the beast who was wounded by the sword and lived. So an image is being made to the beast. That would be the statues of Domitian, so that people would worship it. Verse 15, he was granted power to give breath to the image of the beast, that the image of the beast should both speak and cause as many as would not worship the image of the beast to be killed. Verse 16, he causes all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hand or on their foreheads. So this land beast is responsible for getting people to worship the sea beast. There was a group within the Roman Empire called the Caecilia. You study the word Caecilia, look it up. It talks about a group that was responsible for enforcing emperor worship. Their job was to set up the statues, set up the image, and force people to bow down and worship the image. And so this group within the Roman Empire was an official, of course, of the Roman Empire, was causing emperor worship to be spread all over the Roman Empire. And it was called the Caecilia. And so what you have in this imagery here, they're building images to the beast, the sea beast, and causing people to worship it. And those who would receive a mark on their right hand or on their foreheads. And here comes the mark of the beast. So many people will just get frightened and bent out of shape over this. The mark of the beast. Verse 17. And that one may buy or sell except one who has the mark of the name of the beast or the number of his name. Verse 18. Here is wisdom. Let him who has understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man. His number is 666. Now, I have read that, and right. I have heard that argument. Now, in context here, I don't think it's referring to the Roman Catholic Church. In principle, it would. In principle, it would later on down the road. But here, in its immediate context, it has a significant meaning because of the use of numbers in Hebrew thought. The sea beast and the land beast are all basically working together in one institution, working together in Rome. All of this is representing the Roman Empire. And so when you see the comparison chart If you look at the side that says Daniel 7, if you look down about halfway down, it says, He spake great things. He made war with the saints, prevailed against the saints, speaks words against the Most High for time, and half a time. Well, go to Revelation chapter 13. These beasts spake like a dragon. One of them was like a lamb, but spoke as a dragon. He made war. They made war with the saints, overcame the saints, spoke blasphemies against God, because Domitian wanted to be worshipped, and that continued for 42 months, which is time, and half a time. And so the number, the marking there, is 666. What's our number of completion? 7. 7 is the number of perfection or completion in Hebrew thought. 6 is a number of that falls short of perfection. In Hebrew thought, it represents something that is a failure. It's not quite up to the standard. And you have it 666. It's referring to something that's an absolute, total, and complete failure. So here you have someone that wants to be worshipped. Domitian refers to himself as Lord God, yet his number is 666. He's an absolute, complete failure. And he will be lost, and those who follow him will be lost, as we will see later on in the book of Revelation. He thinks he's a deity, but he's nothing more than a man, and he's a complete and total failure in the sight of God. So that 666 simply means that, and anyone who has that mark is referring to anyone who would fall down and worship the beast and receive that mark in their hand or on their forehead. Some people believe that might have been a literal mark, or it might have been symbolic, talking about this person has fallen down and worshiped the emperor. Think about this. I haven't been to Six Flags in a while, but when you leave Six Flags, once you're in there, what do you get on your hand? You get a stamp. That proves you were there. So if you want to go back into Six Flags, they run that little light over your hand, and they see that mark, that stamp on your hand. So you can go back in there. If you don't have the stamp on your hand, you can't get in there. Now, later on, it's going to talk about those who don't have that mark not being able to go to the marketplace and do their business. Well, those who won't have the mark are the Christians. They're not going to worship the emperor. They're not going to have the mark. This is not talking about microchip technology. What good would microchip technology do for first century Christians who were being persecuted by the Roman Empire to know that 2,000 plus years later, we're going to be able to put microchips under your skin and identify you? Or barcodes. It has nothing to do with barcodes or microchip technology, and people go off on a tangent on this and think that's what it's referring to. Keep it in its context. And in the context there, it refers to someone, 666, someone who is totally and completely and utterly failed. 7 being the number of perfection and completion. So those who would fall down and worship this image, verse 16, he causes both small and the great, rich and the poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their hand and on their foreheads, whether it be literal or symbolic. The point is they're identified with those who worship the beast. That no one may buy, sell, except the one who has the mark, or the name of the beast, or the number of his name. Well, Christians won't. It'd be like being able to go to, every time you go to a store, and this to kind of put it in the modern context, let's say George W. Bush wants to be worshipped. He's got his image everywhere, and we've got to fall down before George W. Bush and worship him as a god. Well, Christians won't do that. Well, the people who won't do that, they won't get the stamp, or they won't get the mark. And you go to Walmart, or you go to Winn-Dixie, or wherever in the world you shop, Albertsons, and they check and see you have that mark or not. And if you don't have that mark, because you didn't worship George W. Bush, you can't go in there and you can't get any groceries. You can't go in there, you cannot purchase anything in any store, because they're going to check for that mark. You put that in the first century setting, that's exactly what the Christians had to face, because they refused to compromise, and they had to face this persecution. We'll continue our study next week.